Hey everybody, Eric Robertson here with another episode of PT Outcast, and we're just going to do a little quick introduction today. Today's episode is with Kendra Gagnon, and we're going to get the great opportunity to hang out with her a couple times early here in our second season of PT Outcast. And in this episode, we're going to talk about this very pressing issue of Grad Plus loan program going away. And if you don't know, this is a program that has largely been a source of funding for lots of people going to grad school, and so has really big implications for the physical therapy profession and physical therapy education broadly. And Kendra has been doing some work writing on a Substack. She's been sort of urgently requesting that everybody pay attention to this. This issue of the Grad Plus loan was packaged into the recent tax law that was passed. If you think it was beautiful, then it was beautiful. If it was big, it definitely was a big bill. I don't know how you want to refer to it, but that was the law that it was into. And so now we're dealing with the consequences when this program ends next year. So this was sort of an urgent, timely discussion. I was happy to have it. I think we're raising some issues. Obviously, we're not solving anything, but I think we all need to start to get our heads around what's happening here. So without further ado, let's just jump right into this episode. And Kendra's going to get us a lot smarter about Grad Plus loans. And maybe collectively, we can continue the conversation and make some positive change or make some plans that we need to make. All right, everybody stay tuned. It was a good conversation. I enjoyed the engagement, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks for joining PT Outcast. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of PT Outcast. I'm thrilled to have with me today Kendra Gagnon. Kendra and I go way back, and she is currently serving in a role as the director of Rehab Sciences Education in the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and she's an associate professor there. And she and I have worked together, talked together in the past, and lately she's been a little bit frenetic writing about some really important issues in the profession. I said she has this wonderful Substack. If you haven't found it, you can get to it from her LinkedIn. It's on all of her posts, and she's posted some really fascinating papers lately. And so, Kendra, you are a perfect PT Outcast guest, and I'm happy to have you here today. So welcome.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So, I think that the things that we can talk about are many. Our interests intersect in quite a few spots. One of them is hybrid education. Another one is just kind of like thinking about the profession in general and the health of where PT education is. And one of your posts that you recently put up on LinkedIn and in the Substack was about the changes in the Grad Plus loans. And that's the first thing I want to talk about, because to me, this is like the biggest, like our boat is taking on water thing going on in the profession in general, right? Like there's always reimbursement challenges and scope challenges. But this is a sort of an unprecedented thing in our sort of modern education stratosphere here. So I guess if people aren't up to speed, maybe give us a quick overview on like what's happening with the student loan thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I totally agree with you. I think it is the biggest change I think that's happened for 20 years. And it has a chance to have an enormous impact on our profession. And was a little bit of part of the reason that inspired me to start my Substack, because it's something that I don't think we're talking about it enough, we're being loud enough about it. And frankly, academic publishing moves too slow for this to
Sure.
so getting something out there, having a space to kind of write about it online and stimulate this discussion and these types of conversations is exactly what I'd hoped. But to kind of get back to your question, the headline here is, in 2005, Grad Plus loan began or was created. And really what that is a federal loan for graduate and professional students, and it allows them to borrow up to the cost of attendance for an institution. So that is important, because that means not just tuition, but it's also living expenses. So housing, they call it indirect costs. And so in essence, I mean, and I'm really simplifying it here for this conversation, but in essence, it created an environment where students had almost unlimited borrowing ability, but just based on it, they could borrow up to whatever the school said it cost for that program: tuition, fees, room, board, housing, personal costs, all of those things. As of July 1st, 2020, the Grad Plus loan program goes away. It no longer
Goes away. It's over.
it's gone. So for the first time in 20 years where there is no grad plus. And so again, knowing that that is the primary for our PT students that borrow money, that is the loan program they use to borrow money. So that's gone. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't other places to take out loans, but it will almost certainly push our students into private loan markets, things like that. So we can kind of have that conversation. But the other thing, and I think the thing that may be even bigger is the federal government is also going to institute borrowing caps for graduate and professional students. And so what that means is that for students that are pursuing degrees that fall under the category of graduate degrees, their borrowing will be limited to $20,500 per year total annually and $100,000 in aggregate. For
Okay.
students who are in professional programs, the borrowing limits will be $50,000 a year and $200,000 in aggregate. Right
Oh, well,
now,
that's great because PT, we're professionals, right?
well, that's what I was going to say. So right now, physical therapy is not included as a professional program. So the way that the initial sort of rule came out specifically lists 10 different programs as professional. This includes things like medicine, law, theology's in there. I think dentistry's in there. Physical therapy is not, along with our friends, occupational therapy is not in there as well. Like we have other close colleagues that aren't in there as well. So as of now, today, this conversation we're recording right now, PT would be under the 20,500 a year and 100,000 total loan caps. Now, rulemaking is still happening and there is advocacy to try to get PT included. So it is possible we will get moved, that we will be included, but as of today, we are not.
Yeah, which is a little scary and also mind blowing.
Yeah.
So, okay, so there's a lot of things there to unpack.
Yeah.
Let's start, let's roll back the clock a little bit and talk about the situation when grad plus loans existed, how this developed, what's the positive of this, what are maybe some of the negatives of this, right? So, one of the things I read sort of preparing for the podcast was like, okay, what was the rationale to get rid of this grad plus loan? And one of the interesting perspectives is, okay, if students can borrow unlimited amounts and the federal government is subsidizing these things, well, that presents like a clear risk to taxpayers,
Hmm.
right? Because if there's defaults or if there's people who don't finish their profession or whatever happens, it's the taxpayer ultimately that's taking on this risk, which is, I mean, it's a little funny because really it's the federal government with their fake
Yeah.
money, but it theoretically it's that. And then the other thing would be that you mentioned schools say they set the tuition.
Yeah. Yeah. So it creates, it does create, I think, some challenging conversations that we need to have about how it lines up the incentives and what impact it may have had. Now, there's not really any way, I think there's so many other things that have happened in the last 20 years that can impact the price of higher education. And so there's not any way that I think any of us can intellectually, honestly, at least sit here and say grad plus loans caused this problem we're in. Because I also think it seems that we all agree. I've not heard anybody recently say anything different, that the cost of a PT degree is too high and it is not, the ROI is a challenge because it doesn't align with the salaries that our students our graduates are making as new grads, or even that we make at our peak in the profession, right? And so I think that we all seem to agree that the cost is high. This is not just a PT problem, though. This is a higher ed problem. The costs of higher ed have skyrocketed. But it's also, and I don't think we could, again, honestly say, oh, well, the grad plus loan environment caused it. But I think you can certainly see a through line here of, again, starting in 2005, when the plus loan program began, and the idea was you can borrow up to cost of attendance, that it does create there's not really any downward pressure on institutions to keep
Sure.
low. And at the same time, you have an environment where there are way more applicants than there are seats. And so it's a really highly competitive environment. And so students are kind of like, I want to be a PT. This seems like a very rare, scarce, product that if you give me a seat, I'll pay whatever you want and I can get the money because the federal government, will give me the loan. And I don't really have to think about that until I'm out in the workforce and the payments come due. And so I think it did those two things together sort of created this environment where programs could kind of set their price and they knew students could get the money. And again, not to say that anybody would do that with a nefarious or malicious intent, but I mean, when it kind of the incentives line up that way, I think the place that we're in is kind of inevitable.
Yeah, it's easy for them to for the Grad Plus loans to be like the bad
Yeah.
actor, right? To just simplify it and say like, well, hey, there was no limit, so tuitions went through the roof, but really tuition and cost of attendance, it's really a multifactorial
Yeah.
issue. So I think that's an important thing, and that's a whole separate conversation about like what drives tuition. One of the interesting things I saw from your Substack, you had all these like inflation adjusted numbers
Yeah.
that you went through and did, which I was like, how do you do that math? That was cool. But one of it was the adjusted salary for PTs over the time, right? So PT, like you stated, that PT programs are longer, so that justifies an increase in tuition. But the cost for like per week cost went up quite a bit, right, from each thing. So do you know? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but those numbers for per week for public and private.
Yeah. So what I did there, and I have a graphic in that Substack post that you're referencing, where I put it all together. But basically, what I did is I went back to 2005, again before Grad Plus started, and I went, what was the average salary for a PT? Not new grad salary, but median salary. What was the average cost tuition and fees for a private? What was the average cost tuition and fees for a public institution? And then I went, okay, and now what is it now? And then I, just basically did some inflation adjusted calculations of like, okay, so in 2024 dollars, because that's for the, what's the change? And so what I found was, again, from 2005 to kind of 2024, 2025, that public institutions tuition and fees actually increased almost 80%.
Wow.
Yeah. Now that's just overall, right? And private institution tuition and fees for a PT program increased 62.2%. So those are so in both spaces, significant increase. Now, again, you kind of mentioned weeks, and that's where I went. I went, well, but remember, in 2005, most programs were bachelor's, masters, right? We weren't really to the DPT yet. So a lot of people might say, well, that's because of length of program. So I also went in and went, okay, fine. So let's look at the number of weeks. And again, the CAPTI aggregate data gives that, what the average program number of weeks then versus now. And so when you normalize it for weeks, public tuition still went up about 60%. And private tuition went up about 8%. So, I mean, we see an increase even when we normalize for program length, and it's
Hmm.
mostly in the public space. And so now the other interesting thing that happened too, though, is the profile of PT programs switched. So there used to be more privates, or I'm sorry, excuse me, there used to be more public than private in 2005. Now we see more privates than publics. So
Right, because a lot of the new programs have been private.
yeah.
Yeah.
And what that I think kind of signals, and again, some of this is conjecture, right? So but I think what that kind of
Yeah,
signals,
we're on a podcast here. We can
yeah,
conjecture all
I'm
day.
sort of
Yeah.
riffing right now, right? But I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that sort of signals is private institutions are, because they don't have those public dollars coming in. I mean, they are more incentivized by, tuition is their revenue. That is, that it is just
Mhm.
a straight line. And so I do think the flip from public to private also signals, again, what I think those of us in the field already kind of know, that a lot of the growth in the last years have been driven by private and probably motivated by institutional bottom line and profits.
Sure.
These programs are, they're cash cows. They
They
just are.
they really are,
They
right? I
are.
mean, it's a well-known thing inside of academia
Yeah.
that if, like, there's a school of health or a college of health and there's a DPT program, that program is probably subsidizing and funding a lot of the other,
Yeah.
health profession programs within that school.
Right. Absolutely. And in private institutions, oftentimes, and I've worked in both settings, and I didn't know this until I worked in private, but when private institutions often, for undergrads, they give tuition discounts. So the sticker price of tuition is rarely what an undergrad pays at a private institution. In graduate and professional education, students at private institutions pay sticker price. They really don't offer those discounts. So again, and this is a higher education issue, not a PT issue, that these kinds of programs are a major tuition driver for private institutions. And so again, I think you kind of put it all together and it starts to paint a picture. I mean, now that said, the biggest increases in tuition came in the public sector, but I think you can't also separate what happened. The public education experienced like major defunding, kind
Yeah.
of in the teens, the early teens. And so I do think you saw, a lot of public institutions and to stay afloat, had to institute things like those tuition differentials, where it's like, oh, here's our
Right.
PT programs, everybody pays $100 more per credit hour. So I do think that there are, again, a lot of other big drivers for this. But I think at the end of the day, when there is a program subsidized by the federal government that says you can get a loan for whatever we say this costs. Again, it just aligns incentives in a way that it does not incentivize you to keep costs down. And I also want to be careful to say this too. Tuition decisions are typically made at the institutional level. So this is
Yeah.
so not any critique of any PT program or program director. Like, for the most part, PT programs and faculty are in there advocating with leadership all the time about cost, but that's not where the decisions are made. And if the
Sure.
students will pay it, the institution says, the students are paying it. You're filling your class. So the tuition,
Yeah, when I was at Utah, we had a remarkable opportunity there when the hybrid was getting designed, because at first they had really high out of state tuition, right? So for in state, it was like, I think 88,000 or something like that. And then out of state was some like 165 or 188, right? And that wasn't going to be sustainable if they were seeking like a tuition base outside of Utah. And so there was this remarkable opportunity where the PT program got to advise the university, and they listened, right? But that's like a rare instance, right? And so that out of state tuition was corrected. They came up with a special hybrid rate. And it was just it was so wonderful, because that was like, wow, like the institution is listening
yeah.
to the department, right? And that doesn't happen a lot. So that was really exciting.
It doesn't. I mean, another example of that, I know my alma mater, University of Missouri, they don't have out of state tuition. Everybody that comes there pays in state, and these are things that
Hmm.
like those kinds of things. Though are also like, I don't know how many people know that, right? But there are examples for sure, pockets of examples. I mean, those are two we know of because we're close to those institutions, right? But the pocket
Sure.
examples where there are really strong, like, advocacy is working. There is some downward pressure. I do think that's tending to happen again more at publics, because I do think there's just a little bit of a different philosophy and mindset in a public. And again, there's public dollars that come in to help subsidize and support. So it's not just,
Sure.
you know, so the bottom line isn't as tuition driven. And that's sort of the realities of those different models.
Okay, so I guess maybe my thought on this is like, okay, so this getting rid of this incentive that might be dangerous. Maybe dangerous is too big of a word.
There's downsides. I think it's fair to say
Yeah,
there's at least some downsides to consider. Yeah.
sure. So we get rid of the Grad Plus, taxpayer risk goes down. This incentive for like ballooning, this downward pressure begins on tuition. This all sounds like great stuff, right? But in the middle, there's probably some really hard things that are going to happen.
Yeah. I think so.
I mean, how do we know what percentage of programs would fall above that cap?
I don't know that. And I think that would, I think that is, this, we could have we could do another podcast episode on this, but of the challenges there are in getting good data about
Yeah.
our professional programs.
Yeah, that's a
I
good
think that would be findable data, but you would probably, because every program does have to publish their cost. But I think at this point, I don't know anywhere other than to go to every single program's website and create your own database. There's nowhere where the data is deaggregated. So I don't know, and I don't think that would be super easy to find. Now, what we do know is that, the average private institution does charge about 125,000 in tuition and fees for total. Now we're talking about the
Mhm.
entire program. And we know
That's
most
tuition and fees, not cost of living.
not cost
Right.
of living. We're not talking about cost of attendance. We're just talking about tuition and fees. And our PT programs now range from 2 to 3 years. So for a 2 to 3 year program, about 125,000. Publics in state are around just under 75,000, and public out of state is right there, is pretty analogous to privates. They're around 120,000. And so we know for total programs, for tuition and fees, if we're in the 20,500 a year, $100,000 aggregate, I would venture to guess. Pretty much every private and probably some publics, particularly those students that are out of state, would fall under those. Now, if we get to the 50,000 and 200,000 for tuition and fees, that'll probably be a little more comfortable for most institutions.
Yeah, but you would need to have a tuition under $100,000 to be able to just borrow the tuition.
That's right. That's right. And
Right.
the
So you would still be like, how do I live?
yeah, and the annual, and that's a really important piece. And the annual piece is important as well. So again, remember that, even at the $200,000 total, that's $50,000 a year. So if we're looking at these privates that, the top of the line privates that are, the average is about 125,000 a year. We know there are some that are way higher than that, over 2 to 3
Sure.
years. Students are going to be banging against or above that $50,000 annual. And your point is perfectly, is exactly what we need to be talking about too. The Grad Plus helps students borrow, which would include cost of attendance too. So housing and food. And so even with this, even if we get into the, the professional bucket and we enjoy those higher loan caps, I still think that we're in real trouble because students are, these are full-time programs. Students need to pay rent and, and eat, and they're not going
Sure.
to. So how are they going to have the money for that? I mean, that's a big question as well, even if they can borrow what they need for tuition.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a scary thing to think about, and because you start like, I mean, you could literally be facing like a drop, like a cliff in
Yes.
terms of enrollments.
And we're already facing that, right? I mean, we've been
Yeah.
talking about the demographic cliff in higher education for a long time. And so for anybody listening that isn't familiar with that, what that is that, after the kind of big financial recession of the late, in 2008, that people stopped having babies. The birth rate plummeted. And so guess what? Those babies that were born in 2008, 2009 are graduating high school and entering college now. And so
Mhm.
there is a cliff now of students, just basically humans of college age, that's here. So we see huge declines in applications for college. And so for us in PT education, we're not getting students for another few years. So we're probably not going to feel that cliff as
Little
much
delayed. Yeah.
until for the next 3 or 4 years. But I think it's important to know too, we have already seen a little bit of a softening in the applications. I think some of that is that students are not as drawn to PT because of the ROI. I think that's real.
Sure.
But that softening, I mean, it is really soft. I mean, but what we also see is that, in a few years there will just be fewer humans that are the age of people that tend to apply to PT school. And so we're going to be competing for market share there in an environment where perhaps students are not going to have access to the money to come to our programs, even if they wanted to. So I think what we're seeing is that, we were already going to see that sort of drop off in the number of people of college age. And so we were already going to be kind of competing for market share, for lack of a better word. And now we're going to be competing in that environment, possibly with a group of people who are not able to access the loans, the money they would need to participate in our program. So they're not going to be able to afford it, even if they wanted to.
Okay, so students might not be able to afford this. There's not going to be the Grad Plus loans. There's going to be other federal borrowing, and then there's going to be a private market. And one of the concerns that has been raised about private markets is that they're not suited to do this amount of graduate loan lending. And they're not suited in several ways, right? They're not suited to take the risk, right? They don't have that, like, I'm the government with fake money tool. They don't have rules and regulations that adequately protect the borrowers. They have limited ability to enact things that students use all the time, like income-based repayment. And they're really dependent upon your credit,
Hmm.
right? And your borrowing ability. So there's a potential for bad actors. There's a potential for like a lot more people to default on the repayment. And then there's the biggest potential in my mind is that just people won't get them.
Right. Right. I agree. I mean, I'm really concerned about the risk as well. You pointed out some things of just maybe not as much protection, no income-based repayment. I mean, some of the things that our students enjoy now too. And the reality is that again, if we look at who is likely to be seeking these additional loans to help cover whatever gap there's left in tuition and fees and, housing and food, the cost of attendance fees are probably some of the people that are the most vulnerable, the most that have I mean, that by definition, that's why they're going to be in that space. And so I worry a lot about the protection for the borrower. I also just worry that we are kind of, if we don't make pretty big change in higher ed and PT ed, that we're sort of looking at a situation where it's going to be the haves or have nots, right? PT
Mhm.
education is going to be a luxury product that you can either afford because you have plenty of money, you have the means to just pay for it in one way or another, or you're going to be forced into this model where, borrowing and interest rates and, even if you can do it and you do it, the downstream effects and the repayment and the payments and the interest rates and all of this will just, I mean, again, just kind of creating this kind of haves and have nots.
Yeah, not to mention, also the one thing that just popped in my head was like student loan forgiveness, right? So if you
Yeah.
work in like a nonprofit center or these things, and you qualify for federal student loan forgiveness, like that goes away too. And there's a big chunk of people that take advantage of that.
Right. And I'm not as, I don't know as much about that, but that's a whole other kind of conversation that seems to be happening as well, as that student loan
Hmm.
forgiveness programs and changes happening there. So I think that's something, that is something we should be watching as well. But exactly. I mean, a lot of, again, the headline I think is kind of the whole infrastructure for how our students pay for their education for the last 20 years is blowing up. Like that is and so
Thus your urgent writing. That's
yeah, I
that's
mean,
why she's on
right,
Substack. Like someone listen.
I
Yeah,
know, and I think that's the thing. I mean, you and I are kind of riffing about why that might be and what the impacts and whatever, but I mean, it is blowing up, and none of us has a crystal ball. But if we aren't, but we definitely need to be talking about it and be proactive about it. And I'm talking to our students about it too. Now, I do want to mention we haven't talked about this yet either. There is sort of if you're already in a PT program, they are going to allow students to continue these with these programs for up to 3 years. So our students who are already in are
they're okay.
they're okay. They're what they signed up for is not changing. So the rug's not being pulled out of from under those students, but our students that come in, again, based on what we know and
Yeah,
what's
starting next year, right? In
starting
26. Yeah.
after July 1st, 2026, those students are going to be there's going to be a whole new ball game for those,
Hmm.
and that's coming quick. I mean, it's just a few months away. Students are making decisions now that will be coming in. So we've got to be up in front of this.
Yeah, it's so perhaps tenuous. I was looking at a job application the other day, and in this job application for a faculty member, it was a university, it was a state funded university in the South, and they advertised that their tuition was low enough to fall below the caps for the borrowing. And so, therefore, their program was likely more sustainable, and therefore, you should go work for them.
Yeah, that's really
And I was
interesting.
like, oh gosh, like, holy cow.
Yeah, yeah. And that, but I think that also signals that a very real possibility that some of these programs may not be sustainable. Because if your tuition is at that high level and your institution is depending on that tuition to maintain the bottom line, there's I mean, you can't just slash your tuition by 20% like tomorrow. And,
Sure. Yeah.
and you know,
Yeah.
and
There's bills, there's people, yeah.
yeah. And if you again, we can all do back of the napkin math and talk about, well, I don't see how they couldn't drop. We know this program can't possibly cost this much, but again, PhD programs are part of an institution and a system. They don't keep all the dollars. They don't, and so if that institution is depending on that for the bottom line, and a 20% cut in tuition could be devastating. If the institution goes under, the program does too. So I do think that what you said about that job posting does signal something that we also need to be thinking about is, and not just kind of what's the impact on the student, but can the programs survive? If we see a huge drop off in applications and programs can't fill seats because students go, I can't do this because I can't get the loans, can they survive? If programs I just don't know. I don't know. I do think though it's going to be big trouble for programs that aren't positioned to
Mhm.
levers to drop their tuition if they need to.
Okay, so you gave the soundbite of the year, which is the entire infrastructure that students pay for our programs is blowing up. The corollary is, therefore, we should probably think about blowing up that infrastructure and redesigning it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. If you're, I mean, you're not just like getting a discount. This whole structure that supports this tuition is going away. Well, it seems like your response to a problem should be proportional to the problem itself. So this probably doesn't take a small response.
No, I don't think so. And I think there are some institutions and programs that are better positioned to weather this and others that are not. What I get discouraged about is hearing, we need to stop slow program growth, stop the growth. We need to contract, partly because, and this is another thing we haven't talked about either, is there's also a reality of the workforce. We're already not producing enough PTs.
Sure. Yeah, we're already underserving society.
We're already underserving society. So any idea that a response to this should be to double down on old structures, to contract, to stop new growth, I think is turning our back on our obligation to
Our
society
primary focus for existing.
and to meet
Right.
societal need. And so I think that what programs should be doing and need to be doing is, I mean, number one, doing an analysis of kind of where they sit in either of
Hmm.
growing environments. If potentially, if they have that information, understand what proportion or percentage of their students use these programs. So what will really be impacted for them, like what the impact will really be locally. And then, really doing some modeling of, what levers can I pull to drop tuition if need be, and of course be talking with their leadership about that at the same time, because again, the tuition decision doesn't come at the program level. But if you're a program director and you want your program to be sustainable, to not go away, I think you need to be ready to sit down with your dean, your provost, your president, whatever that, and say, here, I've done some modeling, here's 4 things we can do, here's 4 levers we can pull.
Yeah, yeah. So, in sort of an ironic sense of there's always something you can find to agree with different people about. Last season, I had Jim Gordon on the podcast, and Jim Gordon gets a lot of flack in a lot of publications about being against certain kind of program growth, and sort of like he's the standard bearer for the academy.
Yeah.
But when he was on the podcast, his first message and his primary message was that the future of physical therapy is not guaranteed.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's a really important statement, because the future of physical therapy depends upon not if people can pay for our tuition, but if we can serve society
Mhm.
in a beneficial way and people find value in that. Right.
Well,
And so if we stop serving, we underserve society to a degree that we're failing in our mission, then suddenly that future gets a little bit more tenuous.
right. And I think this is a real this we are already in a position where we are underserving. We are not producing enough PTs. And this, borrowing situation that's getting ready to sort of blow up on us next year, I think just along with a demographic cliff that was already coming, it's kind of a perfect storm, I think, of us, of I think it's going to it's really it's a moment for our profession that I think, and can we meet the moment? Can we meet the
Yeah,
moment?
I agree. It's a moment, right?
Yeah.
And it's super important podcast. And I think you are invited back. We're gonna have another recording in a couple of weeks with Mary Blankenton, who you and her wrote a nice perspective piece, a commentary about a scarcity versus abundance,
Yeah.
and you know that's going to be a fascinating conversation to have, because it just is a separate part of this argument, or it's maybe the vision for the solution to what this challenge is.
Yeah, no, I can't wait. I'm really proud of that paper. I'd love to get. I appreciate Jim Gordon so much too, and his contribution to the profession, and always being willing to kind of make a little noise and say the thing that
Yeah, he's
I,
happy to stand up and take it a little
I'd
bit.
love
Yeah.
to hear what Jim thinks about the scarcity and abundance perspective as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Maybe you've just scheduled a third podcast. So
Maybe, yeah.
Jim has a little bit more time. He stepped down his chair at USC.
I
So
know.
yeah, we'll see if we can't get him back. And I guess you've mentioned a couple times there's certain programs that are better positioned to weather this, and so it comes into mind. Okay, so hybrid programs,
Yeah,
but that's not the answer all by itself, because hybrid programs cost almost as much as
yeah,
regular programs.
and that's what, I published a paper earlier this year with Teresa Bachman and Amy Garagos, and we did a analysis of basically characteristics of hybrid programs, and we benchmarked them against the national averages, and
Hmm.
that's what we found. I mean, hybrid programs, they cost the same. No, we didn't have the data in a form to do comparative analysis, and I won't go into all of that, so I can't say anything about statistical significance. But I'm telling you, a private hybrid costs about 120, a private or a private non-hybrid, or the national average is about 125. So we're
Yeah.
really about the same. Despite the fact that hybrid programs tend to be a little bit shorter. But again, we in our analysis, there is no evidence that shorter programs are cheaper. And so I sort of hate that argument. I hear that a little bit. It's no evidence that shorter programs are cheaper. Programs are priced based on the market, and the biggest differentiator in price is public versus private, period. Public's cost
Hmm.
this, private cost that. So I do think that, so getting back to hybrid isn't the answer because they're cheaper. They're not cheaper, but it's that cost of attendance piece comes back. So
Sure, because I can just hang out at my house. I don't need a separate rent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's what I would like to see. Again, we don't have the data yet, but this is something an analysis and some work I'd really like to do because what my gut has always told me as somebody who's worked in hybrid programs since almost 10 years now, that it's the life cost thing that matters. So if I'm a student in a hybrid program, I can live anywhere. I can go back home and live with my parents, I can live with my aunt. I can move to the place where the hybrid program is if I want to be closer. I can live in a really low cost city, instead of having to live where I can get to my program, in Chicago or Washington, D.C. So it allows students, I can stay with my partner who's earning an income and they can keep their job because we're not having to uproot. So I do think hybrid programs can help students manage that life cost thing, which if you look at most programs, residential programs, a lot, depending on the city, if I'm in Omaha, maybe the housing is around 24,000 a year. But if I'm in Washington, DC, maybe it's, $38,000 a year. But again, you start to add those things up. And now over the course of a 2 to 3 year program, that could be accounting for, fifty to $100,000 of the student's debt. And now we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of dollars in repayment. So there is something about programs that allow students to manage those life costs that I do think can be very impactful and position them well in this new environment.
And what a statement for allowing programs to proliferate and to grow the number of
Yeah.
programs. Because if you have a hybrid program, there's only five of them, it's still expensive to travel around and you have limited choices. But now it's more and more people are getting regional options for hybrid so they can drive to it. They can, live
Yeah.
nearby, take a train, these kind of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, and I think it also aligns with, programs that are I mean, you mentioned Utah earlier, and one of the
Hmm.
reasons perhaps that Utah was successful, I don't know this to be true, I'm guessing, but was successful in having those conversations about tuition is because they have 3 pathways now, right? They have their Salt
Hmm.
Lake, have their is it St. George, and
St. George, right?
yeah, and then they have a hybrid pathway. And so the other types of programs, and I think the other feature of hybrid that make them, I think, maybe somewhat future proof in this new environment is the ability to scale. Because again, if the reality for the institutional bottom line is we need to bring in X amount of tuition dollars, and I need to decrease tuition by $20,000 to be able to make it manageable for students, then I can offset that by adding a cohort, expanding into hybrid, increasing my class 20%, right? So I can sustain the bottom line at a lower price point. So I think programs
Without having to build like a separate building because you need those people there all the time.
that's right. So I do think there is a scalability that hybrid enjoys that also it just again, I don't know that anybody's going to need to pull that lever or pull it right away, but it gives you the ability to. It just gives
Hmm.
it makes you a little bit more nimble than a program that is built for 24 students in person in a classroom. It's just a little bit more nimble, that teaching online and the immersive lab structure.
Yeah, and they can outcompete, like a hybrid program coming in can outcompete that program without the flexibility, that smaller in-person residential. I spoke to a program director a few weeks ago who was facing the situation where a hybrid program was coming in and going to form in their same city,
Yeah.
and they were sort of petrified about it
Yeah.
because that hybrid program had all these competitive advantages that they weren't going to experience.
Yeah, and so but my question would be, so then why didn't you move first?
Right,
Like, why wouldn't
right.
you again, I think a lot of programs are, thinking about it and there's a lot of programs that I do hear, that are afraid, concerned about, a hybrid program coming into their, community. But I also think that's a message. I don't know. It's like, if you don't do it, someone else will. So
Hmm.
have a really strong, excellent residential program and you believe in the quality of that program, like, scale it. So I do think, I mean, again, we digress. We'll talk about scarcity and abundance next time, but I do think it is a really important conversation that we should be having. And I think that the knee jerk reaction has actually seemed to be more the opposite of sort of double down and contract. And I wonder if, now is not the moment for that.
We'll talk about USC here again, right? That knee jerk reaction, right? They're facing financial pressures, and they're closing the hybrid program. They're going back to their residential only model, and to me, it feels just a little bit tragic because they did have really strong outcomes in the hybrid, um, and that's in a space where not all hybrid programs have that same real strong MPTE performance and those kind of things. And so it feels like they're getting more in their product than abundant. And I was just, you think to yourself, well, why, if there was this financial pressure, why was the residential the model that you went back to versus like converting the entire thing into hybrid?
Yeah. You know, I
Yeah.
cannot
I
comment
mean,
on
I don't,
that. I I do know there are the way that some institutions built hybrid models makes the financials really different for the hybrid path versus the residential
certainly.
path, and I suspect that there's something there for if for anyone that sort of goes that route or for who, hybrid programs can be expensive to start. I mean, you can't just copy paste your residential. I mean, you know this, right? I mean, they really need to be built intentionally from the ground up with really strong instructional design. And so there's definitely a big upfront cost for those programs as well. And I think that does keep some people, out of the space, not having the resources, the instructional design, all of those things.
Yeah, it's actually a lot easier to start a hybrid program from scratch than it is to take your residential program and add a hybrid pathway.
Yeah. I've never added a hybrid pathway to a residential program, so I don't know from experience. But that feels right to me that, adding.
Yeah, having done it a few times now, it definitely is a complex puzzle to solve, because there's inertia, there's the way things are done, there's the way the curriculum was designed with residential only in mind, the clinical partnerships. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but
Yeah.
mostly the factor is how do you fund it, because it's a separate build that you have to do inside of an already functioning business,
Yeah.
and so that's a lot of risk for the program.
It is, and it's a big, and it's a big cost, to lay out. And so I do think it's, yeah, and that's the academy though too, and it's the upsides and the downside. I mean, academic institutions, higher ed, the academy, we move slow and we have a bad rap for it, and often that is very warranted. But I think it's also, important to remember that academic institutions are built to be enduring, they are built to move slow because they're built to not
Yes.
shift on the whim of a new chair or dean or even a president. And so I think that, but again, when you're trying to build something new or to have some of these conversations about how can we completely upend our model of tuition, of financing, how could we grow our program by, 40% while not growing our faculty the same amount? Like what levers can we pull to scale? How can we do this? It sometimes it is, we tradition and process and all of that is just sort of the way the academy is. And so change is slow and there's always a lot of resistance to
Then let's change the system of funding really quickly. And
really.
that's the essence of this conversation and why it's so painful and why this Grad Plus loan change is so potentially dramatic for not just physical therapy, but almost all graduate programs.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a whole thing.
Yeah. All right. So a few takeaways. I think if the listener has, checked out Kendra's LinkedIn and her Substack, definitely go do that. Also, we talked a lot about hybrid education, and you have that benchmarking analysis paper of hybrid programs. Was that was a physical therapy journal? Yeah.
Mhm, it was in
Yeah.
PT. Yep.
Yep. So go check that out. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. I think those are great things to get smart on. Um, and then stay tuned for the next episode when you come back with Mary, and we'll talk more about the scarcity and abundance and kind of look at this from a even more pulled back lens. And I think that's going to be great.
I can't wait.
Yeah, well, this was fantastic. I don't know if I feel better. It was fun to talk to you, but this subject wasn't fun. But, I think that's part of life. So thanks for being here, and a pleasure. And we'll talk soon.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye bye. Thanks, everybody, for listening to another episode of PT Outcast.